Thank you so much for inviting me here today. I mean, we've had a fabulous time last night, and I think you've had some tremendously insightful presentations this morning. And as I got up, Justine said, just make a joke about pre-dinner before you start, because everyone's going for lunch. And I did think to myself, actually, talking about compliance might not be something that thrills many of you, but actually, when we think about today and we think about what has been discussed, is that in reality, the law as a benchmark to what is going on and around modern slavery is just underpinning what we're doing today and where we want to go. And so for my part, I just very briefly to tell you a little bit about who we are, Ardea, and what we do. So we work with a number of organizations across various sectors. We help them identify and manage their risk, particularly around sustainability and modern slavery issues. And we work with business to not only achieve compliance, but to develop their best practice procedures. And one of the things that over the last year that we've been seeking to do is work collaboratively with a number of partnerships, and particularly around data management, the things that we don't do, not our core skills, and with other organizations that have got enhanced skills that we don't offer. So the reason I'm really here today is, on a very exciting note, is that I've been working with IEMA and particularly Mark over the last 6 to 8 months on producing a new guide, which is called Managing Environmental Laws and Human Rights Laws in Organizations. And it was a great opportunity working with IEMA. I enjoyed it massively, and actually I need to say thank you to Mark, because he's got such a wonderful way of working and kept us on track, because this publication is about 165 pages long. And what I'd like to do is just share with you a little bit about the publication, and also just put it in the context as to why we set out to create this new publication. So IEMA published in 2005 the first edition of this particular guide, and it only covered environmental laws, and it has a very specific focus around ISO 14001. When I spoke to Martin Baxter about 5 years ago, I said to him, as a lawyer, this is a really helpful guide, and there's a lot of good stuff in there, but it's so outdated, no one's ever going to bother looking at it, and why don't you think about updating that? And I was delighted in December when Mark called me and said, would I like to work with them on this guide, and shall we also expand it to include human rights laws? And that in itself was an interesting concept, because as most of you know, ISO 14001 is an environmental management standard. It doesn't encompass social issues, but we've kept it within that context, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we've done around that. So the guide itself, I'm going to tell you what it does and what we've looked at. But the question I guess one had to ask in also looking at updating this guide is, why is compliance important? What is it about the law that actually matters, particularly when we have a global landscape where there seems to be such sort of poor law enforcement, poor upholding of the rule of law? Why should we think about this, and why does it matter to business? And I think we have to go back to some fundamentals, and those are that, the law has always provided a cornerstone as a protection for the environment and for human rights, and actually without it operating well and without good frameworks, you just don't have societies where people are protected or the environment is looked after. And so we saw it as critical that, for many organizations, actually addressing how they manage their legal compliance is critical before they can start thinking about what best practice is and what they should be trying to achieve. And we also see that, regulation is increasing, and the involvement of stakeholders in the value of law and discussing this in terms of policy and legislation development is also something that has increased over the last 10 years. So another reason we decided to update the guide is that, as many of you all know, ISO 14001 was updated in 2015, and there were some fundamental changes to the standard and the way that it addresses managing environmental risk, and particularly introducing a new concept around compliance obligations, which wasn't there in the earlier standard. And so, set in the context of the ISO changing, we also set this the need to update the guide in the context of these tremendous landscape changes that I think most of us that are sitting here today will recognize, where we've seen a proliferation of regulation, particularly around reporting, and I'm going to come back to that in my next slide. But we see the fact that companies are more are looking at reputation management. Not all of them. I think there was a really interesting question from someone earlier about, what should the narrative be, particularly to lawyers. We see business costs being squeezed. We see supply chain management as critical. We're now looking at the fact that investors are considering ESG matters in much more in-depth ways. And actually, very interestingly, particularly from our point of view, is the question around insurance in this area. And Laura is going to talk about that in one of the panels this afternoon. But we are beginning to think that there is a need to address insurance issues around labor exploitation in the same way that the businesses addressed environmental insurance. I was working in the city, and we looked at, did a lot of work around environmental insurance 15 years ago as a bespoke product, and I'm sure that this is where some things are going to go in terms of labor exploitation. So if you are interested in trends in reporting, Carrots and Sticks is a publication brought out for KPMG about every 3 years, tends to be launched at the GRI, and you'll see that there's been a 60% increase in mandatory reporting requirements since 2016. What I think is really critical in looking at these, the increase in mandatory reporting is not just the proliferation, but actually what is underlying the requirements in the law. And the trend is now towards due diligence reporting. So that means not just putting up a statement saying, I have a policy in place and, I've approved this by a board of directors and I've signed it. It's actually understanding what your procedures are. It's understanding what underpins those statements. And so you'll see from the examples I've put up on the slides that all these pieces of legislation are actually asking organizations to explain how they are implementing procedures that underpin their policies. And there's a really important legal element in that, because, again, looking at the environmental experience, it is companies will know that they are entitled to have a defense in due diligence and in relation to some of their permitting requirements if they have taken proper steps, and they can actually display that to a regulator to show that they that whatever the breach has occurred has not necessarily been because they've been negligent. And I think this is the way things will go in relation to human rights due diligence in the future, and we are seeing that in some case law in the States now. So in getting information about the guide, we ran a number of workshops and also surveys with the IEMA members, and the workshops we ran across the UK, and trying to establish what some of the barriers were to organizations in demonstrating legal compliance. And you'll see that on the slide that we have, that was just a snapshot, and of course the guide is going to go into this in more detail, but different challenges depending on if it was an environmental compliance or whether it's human rights compliance. Some real concerns about auditing, particularly auditing around human rights issues, because a sense of the fact that auditors don't always know what they're looking for. They don't know, there's not necessarily the uniform standards. People don't know what to do with the data. So lots of different challenges around demonstrating compliance. The other slide that I've just put up, just conscious of time, is, how often do companies actually evaluate their compliance? And so this was also interesting to look at this, because when you look at the numbers, what's not sort of catching one's eye is, a majority, so over 50% saying we regularly evaluate our legal compliance. We do this on a weekly basis or a fortnightly basis or a quarterly basis. Actually, that isn't the picture at all. So we're seeing less than 50% of companies looking at how they evaluate compliance at different times in the year. So what does the guide contain? And this is the exciting bit, I guess, is we are looking at not only kind of sources of environmental and human rights laws. So there's quite a lot of information about international laws, different laws domestically within the EU on both environmental and human rights issues. But we also looked at incorporating information around the social standards, conscious of the fact that we were dealing with ISO 14001, which doesn't necessarily address some of the human rights issues. The main thrust of the guide, though, was to really try and put something together that we hope is going to be useful for practitioners. And if you are going to download the guide, we've got, I think the link actually might be in our slides this afternoon. I don't think I've got it on here, Mark. But if you go to the IEMA website, as an IEMA member, you can download it for free. There's a small cost if you're not an IEMA member. If you do want to tackle it, if you don't fall asleep by page 100 and you think there's some really useful bits and pieces in there, or you'd like to ask some questions, I certainly would be more than happy to address some emails around this, because what we try to do is we've looked at case studies. There's been some fantastic inputs, and thank you to people like Rebecca from the Environment Agency. What else can I see? Sue, doing some work with us this afternoon. Loads of people who gave of their time freely to help us build some case studies. We've built some checklists in. We've tried to give examples of how you might demonstrate compliance through the use of things like legal registers. We've built in a section on going beyond compliance, providing guidance on best practice. And then there's quite a lot of technical data around conformity and auditing. So that's the guide. Really excited that it's launched today. I really hope to hear from you as to what you think about it. I think already there are aspects that are outdated, sadly. So we might be having a conversation, Mark and I, again, about where we go to with this for next year. So thank you very much. Thank you.